Yo, what's up guys? Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for the next Alchemy set for Lorwyn Eclipsed, which is going to be releasing on Arena later today, which I'm really excited about. Now, I haven't really played enough Alchemy recently to be educated enough to talk about these cards in those formats, so in this video I'm just going to be focusing on Historic, and as is the case with most of the Alchemy sets, not all of the cards are going to be playable in Historic. There's only going to be a few that can really cut it, so I'm going to be focusing on the cards first in the video that I think are likely to have an impact, and I will go through all of the rest of them as we go along, but most of them will just be, this isn't going to be powerful enough for Alchemy. So I'll make sure we've got all the historic relevant ones at the start, but I'll still talk about the other ones as we go through. So, in my opinion, by far and away the best card in this set for historic is this one, Aquatic Subtlety. Now, I'm not going to talk about this card in this video because I've already made an entire video dedicated to this card specifically that I released a few days ago, so if you've not seen that, I'll have a link to that down in the description to check it out. But I think this card is going to be a really cool new enabler in Historic and definitely the most powerful card from this set. But yeah, not going to talk about it here. Check out that video if you haven't seen it yet. So the first card I want to talk about here is Echoing Cavern, and this is a brand new land in the same vein as Cavern of Souls and Unclaimed Territory and Secluded Courtyard that we've had in the past. And I do think this is one of the better ones for sure. This is definitely going to be competing with Cavern of Souls for the best tribal support land. Now, I think right now the only real top tier tribal deck is Eldrazi, and the only Eldrazi deck that wants to be running these sorts of lands in high numbers is the low to the ground aggressive Eldrazi variants, and I feel for those decks specifically Cavern of Souls is more important, specifically because of Consign to Memory. If you're running a low to the ground aggressive deck with Linebreaker and Fleshraker which don't have cast triggers, then I think having consistent access to Cavern of Souls to fight against Consign to Memory, which is still quite a common sideboard card, is more important than getting the exhaust on this. But if you're running any tribal lands after that, you know, I have seen a few lists that are running Secluded Courtyard or Unclaimed Territory, then Echoing Cavern is just by far and away the best one because just the exhaust ability is really, really nice to have access to. Specifically in Eldrazi, where they have good access to ramp as well, is a really big deal. It's going to be very easy to, you know, accelerate with your Ugin's Labyrinths and your Sowing Mica Spawns and your Talismans and be able to exhaust this fairly early if you do run out of gas, which is a really big deal because typically outside of Kozilek's Command, Eldrazi doesn't really have good options for card advantage. So just having one on your land, especially in a deck that is good at accelerating, is going to be a really big deal. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if the ramp variant started to run this as just another payoff for your acceleration, because you're going to be able to get the exhaust off even earlier on this. If you have it in multiples, that's great because then you can just seek. So this seems like a really big deal for Eldrazi variants of all kinds, which isn't ideal. I don't think Eldrazi really needed any more tools. Outside of that as well, I do think this is a really big deal for other tribal decks. Like, I have been experimenting recently with both Merfolk and Goblins after we got support from the latest main Lorwyn Eclipsed set, but from my experience, neither of those decks are really powerful enough. Goblins has definitely felt the closest, and there's still some builds of Goblins that I'm testing and slightly optimistic about, but for the most part, Goblins just feels a little bit too slow to close the game out to me, which is a big problem in Historic right now where all the decks are super linear. But if you are running tribal decks outside of Eldrazi, I do actually think this is probably better than Cavern of Souls right now because there aren't generic counterspells that see much play at the moment, and getting that exhaust is a really big deal, especially in a deck like Goblins where you do have access to good acceleration. So definitely a big deal if you're running tribal decks, but yeah, mainly here for Eldrazi, which isn't great because I do think Eldrazi is a problem right now, but that's, you know, a conversation for another video. Then next up we got Reflective Rhymekin, which this card is really interesting to me, and the first thing that comes to mind is using it in a deck like Neoform, because obviously Neoform hasn't been a good deck in Historic for years at this point, but it was always quite clunky to assemble because you needed to fill your deck with dual caster mages, you needed Stormcaller plus Neoform to get the combo off, which was kind of difficult because if the opponent had removal, that kind of didn't work, whereas Reflective Rhymekin coming down and giving you the boon to then use on a later turn makes the combo less, well, first of all, less frail to interaction, but also just makes it easier to pull off. I think the fact it also works with mana value 3 or less rather than 2 means that you could also use it with Eldritch Evolution, which potentially opens up some combo lines as well. So that's the first place that my mind went to, but there are obviously a lot of other generically powerful instants and sorceries that cost 3. I guess you do want to try and get it to 3 to get maximum value off this. So the fact it's a wizard means that it will also work with Flame of Anor, so you can, you know, get quadruple the value of Flame of Anor if this survives when you get to get both modes off it, which is pretty interesting. But for the most part, the first place that I went with this was kind of Neoform Eldritch Evolution, kind of as just a combo enabler, maybe extra redundancy in Neoform alongside Stormcaller, which is something that deck has really lacked and was one of the main weaknesses of the deck. But outside of that, I do think there could be like a standalone Eldritch Evolution combo deck. Definitely let me know in the comments if there are any other 3-mana instants or sorceries that really stand out to you that could work with this, whether that's combo or just generic value stuff. Definitely a very interesting card, but I'm mainly focused on the combo applications with your Neoforms and your Eldritch Evolution. But very excited to try this one out for sure. Then next up, we've got the first Spellbook card in Thought Steel Sprites. So it's flying double team, so when it attacks you get an additional copy, and then whenever you cast spells during the opponent's turn you get to draft a card from its spellbook, and then unfortunately you do have to discard a card, so it's not card advantage, but this is still pretty nice, especially because there are a lot of very nice cards you can get off this. You got Bitter Blossom, Brazen Borrower, a few other fairy support cards. Now fairies is getting support in this set. A few other powerful cards down here as well. Fairies is getting support in this set, but Fairies isn't even close to good enough to be a historic deck. So if this is going to see play, it needs to just be as a generic tempo card in shells like Dimir or Grixis potentially. But the issue there is you're competing with, Modern Horizons 3 generically powerful cards like Tameo and Psychic Frog. There's other cards like Hydroponics Architect, which is a little bit more difficult to work in historic, but I think is a fairly underplayed card in historic. So like I said, for this to see play, it does need to be generically powerful enough to slot into those shells. And the fact that this isn't card advantage, you would need to have less effective cards in your hand to be able to discard for this to be worth it. Although getting double team off this is, means that it has a higher ceiling. So I'm not optimistic that this is going to see play because I do feel like we already probably have better options for threats in tempo decks. But it's an interesting option, and I think the double team is the thing that could potentially push it to be playable, but again, I'm not too optimistic about this one, but it is an interesting option to bear in mind if you are playing a tempo deck and you do plan on playing, mostly instant speed during the opponent's turn. Then next up we got Preponderant Pearl, which I really like the design on this card. I'm not quite sure whether it'll be good enough, but 1-mana artifact. When it enters, you get a Ponder into your hand, and then whenever a Merfolk deals combat damage to the opponent, you can sacrifice it and conjure a Flooded Strand into your hand. So this second part, I'm not really sure is going to be that relevant. Obviously, the whole idea with this is you could run it in a Merfolk shell, but I've played a decent amount of Merfolk, even quite recently with the new cards that came out, and this doesn't really feel like it plays very well with how Historic Merfolk wants to play, in my opinion. I think Historic Merfolk is all about tempo, it's all about getting onto the board early, and so playing this instead of a 1-mana creature doesn't feel great. Ponder also doesn't really play very well with Merfolk. Merfolk is with the mana in the early few turns, you almost certainly want to go Merfolk 1-drop on turn 1, then hold open mana to go Hex Catcher or, flash in a 2-mana Merfolk. You want to be getting on the board with your early mana, not putting an artifact into play and then casting a Ponder and then hoping that you can connect to get a Flooded Strand. So I think in historic, at the very least, where things are fast, and I feel like Merfolk needs to be committing to the board with creatures rather than, this kind of feels like a more of a slow value card. If this does see play in historic, I imagine it will be for this front mode. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is, could you maybe run this in Affinity? Because it is just a 1-mana artifact. It does give you a card which produces value. Ponder is very good card selection. And is a commonly played card in historic, and also there are a lot of cards within Affinity that care about drawing, like Tameo, for example. This could help you flip your Tameo a little bit more easily. So I think if this does see play in historic, it could potentially be in Affinity, which is quite an interesting idea, and it wouldn't surprise me if it does see play there. If you're just using this to get a Ponder and discount your Affinity cards, it seems pretty good value, but outside of that, I'm not really sure where it would see play. Definitely let me know in the comments if you've got any other uses for this. Actually, thinking about it, this could also be useful if you're playing Felia and Dollmaker. So if you're playing Esper Overlord, Overlord of the Balemerc, and then scamming it into play with Dollmaker and Felia, I always felt in those sorts of shells that we lacked good 1-mana blinkable stuff so that we can consistently get value off Dollmaker on turn 2. So if you are determined to still play Overlord plus Dollmaker or Felia, if you're playing Esper Blink, this does seem like a great option to ensure that you also get value on turn 2 off your Dollmakers and your Felias as well. So that's another potential home for this as well. And then next up we got Ura the Imitator, which is a very interesting card. It's basically, it's flash, which means you can play at instant speed, and then it enables you to play instants off the top of your library. Now, it does also have, enable you to play fairies off the top as well, which again, I'm not sure is going to be very relevant. We don't really have enough fairies to build a viable historic deck, I don't think. But if you're playing a deck primarily instants, again, if you're playing a tempo shell, then this seems like a really interesting way to ensure you that you don't run out of gas. Now, having said that, the big weakness here is that, like I said with the previous fairy card, we already have good enough threats in Dimir Tempo to not potentially need this, and running a 3-mana card does cut you off Lurrus, which is a very big downside as well. Not to mention, I think one of the big advantages of the Tempo Shell is that you don't really run out of gas because of the generic power of the MH3 cards like Tameo and Psychic Frog. You don't really tend to run out of gas in those sorts of decks anyway, so I'm really not sure it's worth giving up Lurrus to run this, but I do think, it is generically powerful enough that it's worth looking at the very least. If you are playing a deck full of instants, this does produce a lot of value. It does mean that you don't have to, the fact it has flash itself means that it plays well with your, interactive game plan. Anyway, you can hold open mana and then flash this in. So I doubt this is going to be viable whilst Lurrus is still legal, but it's worth highlighting. I do think it's definitely worth considering, especially if you are running an instant speed tempo style deck. The next up we got Blighted Nightmare, which is kind of a similar to Chthonian Nightmare, which we got in MH3. So this is definitely going to be a contender in Alchemy. I think this is going to be a decent card there. But in Historic, when we've already got Chthonian Nightmare, which I think is easier to enable and is 1 mana cheaper, which is definitely huge because I think the majority of decks that want to run this sort of effect, like Chthonian Nightmare, also want to be running Lurrus, and running this cuts you off Lurrus. So very much doubt this is going to see play in Historic, but definitely an interesting one for Alchemy, I think. Then next up we got Elvish Elegy, 1 mana mill 3, and then return an elf or land card from your graveyard to your hand, and then it gives creatures in your graveyard perpetually +1/+1 as well. So for me, Elves as a deck just hasn't been good enough in Historic, but this is kind of interesting if you're running maybe a Shifting Woodland deck. 1 mana mill 3 and then get a land back to your hand isn't an effect we've got in the past. We have got Seed of Hope, but that only mills 2, and the difference between, seeing an extra card in that context to try and find a land is pretty big. So I think maybe you would consider this in a Shifting Woodland deck because it fills your graveyard to get Delirium online, gets key cards in the graveyard, and potentially gets you Shifting Woodland back as well, which is kind of interesting. But again, there is a fail rate on that. You'd need to be running a reasonably high land count to consistently hit, especially if you cast this on turn 1 as well. Now, the other big thing is it is a Kindred sorcery as well, so that does count as 2 card types, I believe, which is a very big deal for, Shifting Woodland, for example. So if you are running Woodland, this definitely seems like a card that could enable you to get it online a little quicker. So definitely think I'm going to be testing it there. Outside of that, though, Elves as an archetype haven't really been good. The elf support that we're getting in this set is all to do with Golgari graveyard interactions, which isn't, the most powerful stuff within Elves is all about mana generation, swarming the board really quickly and activating your Allosaurus Shepherds, using Green Sun Zenith to get Craterhoof Behemoth in play if you can get that amount of mana. So I don't think it really is going to be good enough to be a support card for Elves in Historic at the very least, but it seems pretty interesting to me if you're running Shifting Woodland. So yeah, definitely going to be trying it in those sorts of lists. Then next up we got Adherence Heirloom, which is a card I was dismissing kind of early on when I saw it, but the more I think about this, there is a chance that perhaps Eldrazi would be interested in this as well. Again, not great for Eldrazi to get more tools, but it is acceleration that also tutors an Eldrazi creature, which means that if you're running a build with, acceleration and then a bunch of 7-drops and, maybe you've got Thought-Knot Seer and Sowing Mycospawn as well as creatures, this does seem like an interesting option that you can accelerate into, offer Utopia Sprawl or an Imprinted Ugin's Labyrinth to give you extra acceleration into your top end and then find you a creature as well. Because, if you're playing Eldrazi, you are accelerating into your top end. Now, obviously, this doesn't cast Kozilek's Command, which is a bit unfortunate, but for the most part, you are accelerating into your 7-drop creatures in Eldrazi, so this could be an interesting option there as just a way to ensure that you don't run out of gas in Eldrazi, which does happen sometimes if you don't have an early Kozilek's Command, so definitely another card that could be worth trying in Eldrazi, but again, that archetype doesn't really need any more support right now, in my opinion. Then next up, we got Salicinder and Suit Rascals, which I really like the design on this card. It's really cool. So when it enters, you get, or when you cast an elemental, you get either Rite of Flame or Take Inventory. And if you're not sure what either of those are, Rite of Flame is this card here, which is basically kind of like a Storm Enabler in a way. And the more copies you get, the more mana you produce. And then same sort of thing with Take Inventory. You draw a card and then you draw extra cards depending on how many more Take Inventories you've got in your graveyard. So The only real application I can think of this in Historic is if you pair it with Displacer Kitten, you can go infinite there, right? You cast the Rite of Flame, then use the Displacer Kitten to blink the Salicinder and get another one and just keep going, produce infinite mana, and then it does only produce infinite red mana, meaning you can't then turn that into infinite card draw with Take Inventory. So even there, when you've got 2 4-mana creatures for a combo, it doesn't necessarily enable you to win the game immediately. The one application I can think of is getting Rite of Flame is a pretty big deal for Storm decks, because I think one of the issues, especially for Ruby Storm and Historic, is that outside of Manamorphose, the only other Storm generator that we've really got is Burgi, which is a really clunky card. I don't really love having to play Burgi in those sorts of decks. So you could potentially use Salicinder to find Rite of Flame in those lists to go off with Underworld Breach, but like I said, Burgi is already clunky at 3 mana, so having to put a 4-mana card in that then means you then need to have another spare red mana to cast Rite of Flame seems pretty clunky. So this is mainly one where I like the design on it, and I do think it's going to be powerful in Alchemy potentially if you're running it with elementals to consistently trigger this as the game goes on. But in Historic, this just seems a little bit too slow and clunky, but I do really like the design on it. Then next we got Current Curriculum, another Azorius Merfolk support card, and this one does have a pretty high ceiling, but I just don't think we have good enough tools to support it yet, right? If we had powerful, 5 and 6 mana Merfolk in the vein that Goblins has Muxus, for example, then this card is a lot more interesting. But the issue with this is just that we don't have any really good Merfolk that are expensive that we want to cheat in with this, right? If this was a Goblins card, then this would be super sick at cheating, stuff like Muxus in play. But as things stand, I don't really think there's enough expensive Merfolk that you'd really want to play this with. And then the awkward thing, even if there were, the awkward thing with this is that Merfolk doesn't really have much acceleration. So say there was a 6-mana Merfolk Muxus, when you don't have Current Curriculum, it's just going to get stuck in your hand because Merfolk has no real mana acceleration either. So there's a bit of issues there. So if you're not familiar with the card that it conjures, I don't actually have it here, but Stony Brook Schoolmaster, I think I've got it later somewhere. But basically, it's a card that, when you tap Merfolk, you get tokens. It's just a little bit too slow. So I think the big issue with this card is just that we don't have a Merfolk that's worth cheating in with this. If we do get that in future sets, then it could be worth returning to. But for now, I don't really think we have enough cards to support this in Historic anyway. The next up, we've got Adaptive Armorer. And we're moving more towards the cards in the video that I don't think really have many Historic applications, unfortunately. But this one, 4-mana card. When it enters, you draft a card from its spellbook. And then when it enters, you get to attach it immediately, which is quite nice. So the spellbook, if you're not familiar, you got it here. So we got Amorphous Axe, Citizen's Crowbar. Cloudsteel Kirin is the most interesting one because it kind of gives you, it allows you to dodge the reconfigure cost, which gives you kind of like an immediate Platinum Angel style effect, which is kind of interesting, but chances of getting this one are pretty low. So if you're trying to do that sort of thing, it's not very consistent. Conqueror's Flail, Fleet Sheriff, Fishing Pole, Crowvold Haunch, Leech Gauntlet, Line Sash gives you Graveyard Hate, which is kind of useful. But then there's a lot of misses with this card. I think, especially in Historic, this is just nowhere near good enough. If you could consistently get Cloudsteel Kirin, then it might have applications, but even then, it's probably a little bit too slow. So, cool card, but just no Historic applications, I don't think. Then, this is the card for the Merfolk Convoke card. Stony Brook Schoolmaster, so it's a 1/2, and then when this creature becomes tapped, to enable your Convoke synergies, you get a 1/1 token. So again, just too slow. I think if we do get a big Merfolk, then that Convoke card is worth returning to. But right now, just feels a little, it doesn't really enable anything that powerful. Then Thoughtworth's Call, you either get to seek a Kithkin or give creatures in your hand perpetual +1/+1. Kithkin, nowhere near playable in Historic, so the first part isn't really going to be applicable, and then giving creatures in your hand perpetually +1/+1, again, just not good enough for Historic, unfortunately. So next up we got Infestation. So it has Wither, which means that if creatures are dealt damage, they're dealt in -1/-1 counters rather than conventional damage. When it enters, you get this card, Blowfly Infestation, and you deal -1, you put a -1/-1 counter on each creature, including yours as well, which is notable, but when creatures die from your -1/-1 counters, then Blowfly Infestation allows you to put another one on another creature. So I guess the idea here is that if the opponent has a 1 toughness creature, a 2 toughness creature, and a 3 toughness creature, you can either cast this or evoke it for a little bit cheaper. Kill one creature, triggers your infestation, kills another creature, triggers your infestation, kills another creature. But it requires such a situational board state for this to be effective, especially in Historic, where a lot of decks either don't have creatures or their creatures will outscale this, because the big weakness of this card is if this first -1/-1 counter doesn't kill anything, it doesn't really do all that much, and it's so expensive for Historic as well. It's kind of interesting in Alchemy, especially if the format does go more aggressive, for example. You know, if Mobilize sees more play, then it's kind of interesting there, but for the most, well, in Historic, it's just too expensive and too inefficient for what we need. The next time we got Putrid Hex Hag, so the idea with this card is you put counters on it, and then you can give this perpetual ability to your opponent's creatures to deal them a bunch of damage when they die. Unless there's a combo with this card, which I don't think there would be, this doesn't really seem good enough. I don't really see what the Historic application of this would be, unfortunately. So again, I don't think this one's going to be good enough for Historic. We got Craterous Stomp, which is 2 mana, deal 3 to a creature, and then gives all of your opponent's creatures cowards, means they can't block giants or warriors. Now, giant or warrior tribal hasn't been ever good enough in Historic, so that this part isn't really relevant unless changing the opponent's creature type is a combo with something else that I'm not sure about. I don't really think there is a combo around this, so again, I think this is just too inefficient for Historic, unfortunately. Next up, we got Limitless Rekindling. I love the design on this. This is really cool. So you conjure a random instant or sorcery from the Lorwyn Eclipsed main set, I believe. Maybe they'll add the Alchemy cards into this as well. And then it has Storm. So it is kind of a payoff for Storm, but it's an unreliable one, right? The chances of you getting a win condition off this aren't guaranteed. So if you're running a Storm deck, you just run Grape Shot over this. The fact this is 5 mana also makes it much more difficult to achieve in the first place. So again, don't think this is ready for Historic, but I love the design on it. It's really cool. And the next up, we got Tend to the Kiln. So when it enters, it turns all of your instants and sorceries into Kindred Elemental instants and sorceries, and then when you cast an elemental spell, you then get counters on it, and then you can remove those counters to get Flame Braider into play, which is this card here, where you can then accelerate into your other spells. It just seems too slow and dirty for Historic. Unfortunately, you know, this is pretty much what I'm going to say about all the rest of the cards in this set, because a lot of them are designed specifically for Alchemy, but it's a cool design. I like the idea of it, but again, it's just going to be too slow and too clunky for Historic, unfortunately. The next up, we got Gilt Leaf Alchemist, which is, you know, worth talking about in Historic, because it is a very powerful effect. The issue, though, is that it's a 1 mana dork that is not going to be able to consistently be used on turn 2, which is a big problem when we already have Birds of Paradise, Delighted Halfling. You know, the list goes on of playable turn 1 mana dorks that are always going to be able to activate on turn 2. Now, obviously, the big upside of this card is you get a forest every single turn, so it's kind of not scaling exponentially, but you're getting much more acceleration than a conventional mana dork would give. But the reason to run 1 mana dorks in Historic is to cast your 3 drops on turn 2, and this just doesn't do that consistently enough. If this said activate only if 2 or more creature cards in your graveyard, then I'd be much more interested, because you could potentially go this on turn 1, then Malevolent Rumble or whatever other mill enablers that you're running to get the 2 creatures in the yard. But you know, the fact you have to jump through hoops to turn your 1 mana dork online just makes me think this is going to be unplayable in Historic, unfortunately. The next time we got Opulent Clomper, which is kind of the first in the vivid, you want, you know, multicolored stuff in play for it to do stuff. This does scale, you know, you can turn it into a 2 mana 5/5, which is okay, but even then, even if this came down as a 2 mana 5/5, I don't think, I mean, that would be powerful, but I don't think it's going to be good enough to see play in Historic. The fact that the majority of the time this is going to be coming down as a much smaller creature, the fact that there aren't many multicolored decks in Historic right now for this to slot into, and the fact that generic, you know, vanilla creatures aren't really that good in Historic right now. Anyway, it makes me think this just has no chance of seeing play there, unfortunately. Next up, we got Topsoil Turner. When it enters, Forest and Tree Folk in your hand perpetually gain add double green. So the only way this would see play in Historic is if you're running a deck with all forests, and then, you know, you cast a Utopia Sprawl on 1, then this on 2, and then all of the forests in your hand perpetually gain double green. But that's the best case scenario. The fact that it only does forests in your hand and not the rest of your library means that, you know, if you just don't happen to have, you know, a forest in your hand when you cast this, it's pretty bad. It's going to be a bad top deck later in the game. We have much better acceleration anyway, especially at 3 mana. So again, just don't think it's going to be efficient enough for Historic, unfortunately. The next time we got Wild Growth Summoner, and I did consider whether this card would be good in Devotion potentially, because it can be hit off Storm the Festival. It does have triple green pips, but I think for this to be playable, it would need to affect lands already in play, and if it did do that, it would probably be a little bit too powerful. So when it enters forest in your hand and your library, so unlike the other card, it does actually affect all the lands in your library, so much better in terms of a late game top deck there. Yeah, they become 3/4 with reach and haste, which is pretty nice. You know, that does allow you to block against flying creatures, which is something that Devotion has struggled against, but the fact it doesn't do anything to your forest in play just makes it seem a little bit too slow for me. The fact it doesn't have any keywords itself either, right? If it had reach or haste itself, then I'd be kind of a little bit more interested in it, but I think we just have better options in Devotion. I don't think Devotion is a particularly good deck right now anyway. Maybe if Eldrazi does get hit, then Devotion can take that kind of slot as, you know, the generically powerful deck without much interaction that can go over the top of mid-range decks potentially, but I just feel we have better options. So unfortunately, I don't think this one's going to see play either. The next one we got Circadian Struggle, another Vivid card that, you know, seeks cards depending on how many colours you got in play, and then, you know, also reduce them. So pretty powerful effect, but it's 6 mana. It requires you to have cards of multiple colours in play. So it's just too expensive, doesn't fit in any decks really, and just you have to jump through too many hoops, and it doesn't even impact the board really. So yeah, definitely not going to see play in Historic, I don't think. The next we got the Grand Goat Napper, which I love the design on this. You know, affinity for goats is pretty funny, and then it does enable you to steal your opponent's creatures because you can turn a non-goat into a goat, and then you get Goat Nap into your hand, which is this card, which then enables you to steal your opponent's creatures and buff them if they are a goat, which presumably they will be when you activate it. But it's 4 mana, it's so slow. You know, it's only really going to be good against decks like Auras, at which point you're already dead by the time you cast this and then wait to untap. So very cool design, but just too slow for Historic. Next up, we have got Kithkin Brinefarer. Again, Kithkin just not going to be good enough, and I might as well just skim through the last ones, honestly, rather than just saying it's too slow, because Kithkin support, there's just not going to be a Kithkin deck good enough, and this basically only synergizes with Kithkin stuff. Pep Raucous Raider, kind of an aggressive card, but, you know, again, Gruul aggressive decks haven't been a thing for years at this point, and we have much better options at the 3 and 4 mana slot than this. Same sort of thing with Perennial Grave Warden. Like I said, all these support cards that kind of synergize with graveyard synergies with elves don't maximize the good part of Historic Elves at the very least, and Historic Elves hasn't been good enough for years at this point as well, so yeah, just don't think this one's going to see play at all. Maybe in Alchemy it'll be good. Providence of Night, again, another support card for the Vivid sort of decks, but again, they're not a thing in Historic, and this is just way too inefficient and way too slow for that sort of thing. Thornlet and Twigtooth, again, it's just too expensive, too slow, doesn't really fit into a deck, unfortunately. And then the same sort of thing with Volatile Rift. Again, these Vivid decks, just not a thing in Historic, and all these support cards are just way too slow. So unfortunately, the majority of the cards in this set are too slow for Historic. Once I've played Alchemy a little bit more, hopefully the future Alchemy sets I can assess for Alchemy as well, because like I said, the majority of these cards aren't really Historic playable. The main ones I'm excited about, Aquatic Subtlety. This one, I have a very good feeling about. I think this card is just on paper just seems so broken. Obviously, it does have its own weaknesses. If you build your deck around Aquatic Subtlety, for example, there isn't really much redundancy to get this sort of effect, which means the decks built around it might be a little bit too focused on it, meaning you're vulnerable to stuff like Test of Talents and Extraction effects, but this seems like by far and away the best card from the set, and I definitely recommend you check out my other video on this if you haven't seen it yet. But outside of that, Echoing Cavern, big deal for Eldrazi, which again, not sure I love because that deck already has too much good support in my opinion. Reflective Rhymekin, this is one of the ones that I'm most excited about in terms of, you know, potentially enabling Neoform again and just opening up some other combo possibilities, which is pretty interesting. And then the rest of this stuff, you know, Preponderant Pearl I think has a few applications in fringe decks like Affinity or Esper Blink potentially. And then outside of that, I think the rest of the stuff is more fringe stuff. Like I said, Adherence Heirloom could be interesting in Eldrazi potentially. Blighted Nightmare's a little bit too expensive. If you're running Shifting Woodland, Elvish Elegy could be worth trying. But again, there's perhaps a fail rate on this because you only mill 3. So there are a few cards that I'm interested in trying for Historic. Main ones being Aquatic Subtlety, Echoing Cavern, Rhymekin. I'm going to test Thoughtsteel Sprites in Dimir Tempo, but I'm not really sure that's going to be worth it. And then Preponderant Pearl, definitely going to be trying it in Affinity, definitely going to be trying it in Esper Blink as well. And then the rest of the stuff I think is much more fringe. And then past this, You know, we're moving on to more stuff that's just designed for Alchemy and not on the same power level for Historic. The one exception may be current curriculum again. If we do get an expensive Merfolk, then this is a really nice enabler for it, but right now it doesn't really do much. So let me know in the comments if there's any applications of these cards that I did miss, because I think especially with these Alchemy cards, there are some kind of fringe interactions a lot of the time that I don't pick up on. But yeah, like I said, mainly going to be focused on Aquatic Subtlety once this set drops. So yeah, definitely let me know in the comments what you're planning to build and if there are any interactions that I missed out. But either way, once this set comes out, I'm going to be testing it a bunch. I'll hopefully have a lot of different builds. Also, as well, if you got it to the end of the video, if you're an MTG Zone Premium member, I've already put out a premium article with theory craft deck lists built around Aquatic Subtlety that I've tried not tried so far, but I'm planning to try once the set comes out. And I do think there's so much cool stuff that you could do with this. So if you're interested in picking up some ideas that I'm going to try when the set drops, feel free to check out that article. I'll have it down in the description as well. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.